Sardanapalus, sometimes spelled Sardanapalus, was, according to the Greek writer Ctesias, the last king of Assyria, although in actuality Ashur-uballit II, 612–605 BC, holds that distinction. Ctesias' book Persica is lost, but we know of its contents by later compilations and from the work of Diodorus. 2:27. In this account, Sardanapallus, supposed to have lived in the 7th century BC, is portrayed as a decadent figure who spends his life in self-indulgence and dies in an orgy of destruction. The legendary decadence of Sardanapallus later became a theme in literature and art, especially in the Romantic era. The name Sardanapallus is probably a corruption of Ashurbanipal, an emperor-king of the Assyrian Empire. But Sardanapallus as described by Diodorus bears little relationship with what is known of that king, who in fact was a militarily powerful, highly efficient and scholarly ruler, presiding over the largest empire the world had yet seen. Story according to Diodorus. Diodorus says that Sardanapallus, son of Anaxagoras, exceeded all previous rulers in sloth and luxury. He spent his whole life in self-indulgence. He dressed in women's clothes and wore makeup. He had many concubines, female and male. He wrote his own epitaph, which stated that physical gratification is the only purpose of life. His lifestyle caused dissatisfaction within the Assyrian Empire, allowing a conspiracy against him to develop led by Arbaces. An alliance of Medes, Persians and Babylonians challenged the Assyrians. Sardanapallus stirred himself to action and routed the rebels several times in battle, but failed to crush them. Believing he had defeated the rebels, Sardanapallus returned to his decadent lifestyle, ordering sacrifices and celebrations. But the rebels were reinforced by new troops from Bactria. Sardanapallus's troops were surprised during their partying, and were routed. Sardanapallus returned to Nineveh to defend his capital, while his army was placed under the command of his brother-in-law, who was soon defeated and killed. Having sent his family to safety, Sardanapallus prepared to hold Nineveh. He managed to withstand a long siege, but eventually heavy rains caused the Tigris to overflow, leading to the collapse of one of the defensive walls. To avoid falling into the hand of his enemies, Sardanapallus had a huge funeral pyre created for himself on which were piled all his gold, silver and royal apparel. He had his eunuchs and concubines boxed in inside the pyre, burning himself and them to death. The Greek writer Diodorus of Iasus composed an epitaph on Sardanapallus, which he claimed to have been translated from Chaldean. Historical authenticity. There is no king named Sardanapallus attested in the Assyrian king list. Parts of the story of Sardanapallus seem to be related in some degree to events in the later years of the Assyrian Empire, involving conflict between the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal and his brother Shamash-shum-ukin, who controlled Babylon as a vassal territory on behalf of his brother. While Sardanapallus has been identified with Ashurbanipal, his alleged death in the flames of his palace is closer to that of his brother Shamash-shum-ukin, who became infused with Babylonian nationalism and formed an alliance of Babylonians, Chaldeans, Elamites, Arabs and Sartians against his master in an attempt to transfer the seat of the vast empire from Nineveh to Babylon. There is no evidence from Mesopotamia that either Ashurbanipal or Shamash-shum-ukin led hedonistic lifestyles, were homosexual or transvestites. Both appear to have been strong, disciplined, serious and ambitious rulers, and Ashurbanipal was known to be a literate and scholarly king with an interest in mathematics, astronomy, astrology, History, zoology and botany. It was Shamash-Shum-Ukin in Babylon who was besieged and defeated, and his allies crushed, not Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. After the former's defeat in 648 BC, an inscription of Ashurbanipal's records that they threw down Shamash-Shum-Ukin, enemy brother who attacked me, into the raging conflagration. The actual fall of Nineveh occurred in 612 BC after Assyria had been greatly weakened by a bitter series of internal civil wars between rival claimants to the throne. Its former subjects took advantage of these events and freed themselves from the Assyrian yoke. Assyria was attacked in 616 BC by allied forces of Medes, Scythians, Babylonians, Chaldeans, Persians, Cimmerians and Elamites. Nineveh was besieged and sacked in 612 BC. Ashurbanipal's son Sin-Shah-Ishkun, the third of four kings to rule after Ashurbanipal, was then ruling as king of Assyria. He was probably killed defending his city in the sack, though records are fragmentary. Ashur-uballit II succeeded him as the last king of an independent Assyria, ruling from Haran, the last capital of Assyria, until 605 BC. Assyria survived as an occupied province and geopolitical entity until it was dissolved after the Arab-Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD. The area is still inhabited by a now Christian and still Eastern Aramaic-speaking indigenous Assyrian minority today. Recently, Sardanapallus has been identified with Ashur-uballit, the son of Shalmaneser III, who led a rebellion against his father. Alleged tomb. On the eve of the Battle of Issus, 333 BC, Alexander's biographers say, Alexander the Great was shown what the locals purported to be the tomb of Sardanapallus at Anchialus in Cilicia, with a relief carving of the king clapping his hands over his head and an inscription that the locals translated for him as, Sardanapallus, son of Anaxagoras, built Anchialus and Tarsus in a single day. Stranger, eat, drink and make love, as other human things are not worth this, signifying the clap of the hands. Historically, there is no record of any Assyrian king dying or being buried in Cilicia. In art and literature, in the introductory pages of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, those who, erroneously, according to Aristotle, equate the good life with a life of brute pleasure likened to Sardanapallus. The death of Sardanapallus was the subject of a Romantic period painting by the 19th century French painter Eugène Delacroix. The death of Sardanapallus, which was itself based on the 1821 play Sardanapalus by Byron, which in turn was based on Diodorus. E. H. Coleridge, in his notes on the works of Byron, states, "It is hardly necessary to remind the modern reader that the Sardanapallus of history is an unverified if not an unverifiable personage. The character which Ctesias depicted or invented, an effeminate debauchee, sunk in luxury and sloth, who at the last was driven to take up arms, and, after a prolonged but ineffectual resistance, avoided capture by suicide, cannot be identified." Sardanapallus is a hero in The Fall of Nineveh by Edwin Atherstone. He is portrayed as criminal who ordered 100 prisoners of war to be executed and burned his palace with all his concubines inside. Hector Berlioz, the 19th century French Romantic composer, wrote a very early cantata on the subject of the death of Sardanapallus. It was his fourth and finally successful attempt in the Prix de Rome competition, run by the Paris Conservatoire. Only a fragment of the score survives. Franz Liszt began an uncompleted opera on the subject, Sardanapalus. Henry David Thoreau writes in Walden, It is the luxurious and dissipated who set the fashions which the herd so diligently follow. The traveler who stops at the best houses, so-called, soon discovers this, for the publicans presume him to be a Sardanapallus, and if he resigned himself to their tender mercies he would soon be completely emasculated. Quote, in A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens describes the French court, and by extension the French monarchy and upper class. It had never been a good eye to see with, had long had the note in it of Lucifer's pride, Sardanapallus's luxury, and a mole's blindness. Quote, see also, Dionysus Sardanapallus, a sculpture of Dionysus erroneously named after the king. Sardis, Shardana, the text of the Diodorus passage. Text of Byron's Sardanapalus. Another text of the play.